This is why they don't want you to watch until the end, and you're about to understand why. In a solemn Paris chamber after Waterloo, heavy curtains swallow the grey daylight while maps and sealed packets cover a long table. And Napoleon stands perfectly still with his hand braced as if he could pin reality down. The room holds one cold question: was his limitless ambition pure strategic genius? Or the unmistakable craving of a man addicted to power? Outside, Paris looks normal only from a distance: shuttered windows, guarded corners, trunks stacked by doorways, because everyone feels the same fragile tension. As if one rumor could ignite the city again, and the empire's collapse has turned ordinary streets into corridors of quiet fear. On a damp parade ground, discipline forms a hard geometry as an officer grips a sealed directive and a commander watches with loyalty turning into danger. The silence suggests that when a single man rises too high, everyone who climbed with him becomes vulnerable to the fall. At Rochefort's wind-battered harbor, rope, crates, and packed luggage sit like evidence of surrender while Napoleon faces the sea, the one frontier he cannot outmarch, and the shoreline becomes a brutal boundary between command and captivity. On a British deck, sailors move with routine calm around an extraordinary prisoner, and Napoleon stands near the rail under a flat grey horizon, guarding his posture as if dignity is his last territory while sealed paperwork quietly decides his fate. In an English port, crowds gather behind barriers with fascination more than hatred, staring as though they are watching a storm made human. And Napoleon's mere presence still bends attention, proof that power can vanish while the spell of power remains. In a London government office, officials study ocean routes and distant islands on unlabeled charts, weighing a living symbol like a security risk, and the fear of his return becomes the clearest measure of how deeply his ambition reshaped Europe. In a cramped ship cabin, a desk holds blank pages, wax seals, and a folded map without names while guards and attendants form a triangle of surveillance and solitude. And Napoleon's gaze lingers on paper as if controlling the story might replace controlling the world. St. Helena rises from the sea like a natural fortress: steep cliffs, sparse buildings, endless distance, and Napoleon stands under watch on a narrow path, discovering that geography itself can be a jailer no genius can negotiate. At Longwood, the room is plain: desk, lamp, blank sheets, unmarked books, and the quiet is relentless. Napoleon remains composed. Yet the stillness hints at a new battle against time, irrelevance, and the loss of command. In the thin garden air, a simple fence line and a distant guard post define his world. And Napoleon pauses as if listening for drums that will never sound, forced to test whether ambition can become reflection, or only restless hunger. In a small medical room, bottles and instruments sit neatly arranged while the emperor becomes a patient observed with careful distance. And the body that carried an empire now imposes limits that no strategy can outflank. In the bedchamber, heavy curtains soften the light and companions stand close. Yet the end remains solitary, and the man who demanded history obey learns that history does not pause for rank. At a simple gravesite, wind moves through grass and stone while a small group stands in restrained stillness. And the body disappears into earth even as the legend begins to expand: power dying, obsession surviving. Years later, a formal Paris hall stages a solemn ceremony that restores Napoleon to national memory, reclaiming him through polished ritual and controlled emotion as the state turns a former threat into an artifact of identity. In a cramped printing workshop, pressers, ink, and blank column layouts sit under the stare of an overseer holding sealed instructions. And the emptiness of the page reveals a different conquest: the control of what people are allowed to know. In a police office packed with filing cabinets and an unlabeled map webbed with pins, officials stand over sealed dossiers like engineers of suspicion, and the line between protection and oppression grows thin in the name of stability. In a grand hall of honors, unmarked medals rest on trays and recipients stand frozen in disciplined lines before Napoleon. As loyalty is manufactured through reward, raising the final tension: brilliant statecraft that binds a nation, or the constant feeding of a ruler who can never feel enough. Inside a vast cathedral-like space, candlelight climbs stone arches while clergy, officials, and guards hold their positions in a silence that feels negotiated. And sealed packets on a table hint that legitimacy is being arranged like a campaign. Napoleon stands calm at the center, proving he knows faith cannot be defeated by artillery, only managed, genius stabilization, or power addiction that cannot tolerate any authority outside his grasp. In a state classroom, wooden benches and pale window light create an innocent scene that is quietly controlled. As students sit rigid with notebooks open to blank ruled pages and a government inspector watches with a sealed packet in hand, education becomes a tool to shape citizens into predictable parts of a centralized machine, visionary modernizer, or ruler training obedience before independent thought can form. In an imperial chamber, small crowns and family appointments sit like silent weapons beside an unlabeled map of Europe, and relatives or newly installed rulers stand motionless as if waiting to be moved. Napoleon turns the continent into a family structure, trying to make power hereditary and permanent, strategic network building, or an obsession with control that treats even blood ties as chains. In a cramped conscription room, young men stand in a tense line while parents hover behind them with faces locked in fear. And a table of blank ledgers and measuring tools turns human futures into entries, the state calls. And Napoleon's ambition consumes youth as fuel, nation building through mass mobilization. Or a dependency that always needs more bodies to keep the machine running. In a field hospital, lantern glow falls on bandages and closed instrument cases as surgeons hold still beside rows of wounded. And administrators sort sealed packets and supply lists like battlefield logistics. Napoleon appears at the threshold, measuring cost without letting emotion interrupt momentum, cold clarity that wins wars, or numbness that proves power has become a habit stronger than empathy. In an artist's atelier, a giant canvas freezes Napoleon into heroic posture while assistants hold draped fabric and the painter raises a brush like a priest of myth. The portrait sells immortality, turning leadership into iconography, brilliant mastery of public psychology, or the hunger of a man who needs worship as much as victory. On a Paris construction avenue, stone blocks, scaffolding, and surveying tools align with severe precision as officials gather around an unlabeled scale model. And Napoleon studies the city like a monument in progress. Infrastructure becomes permanence, forward-thinking investment, or a craving for legacy carved into the capital because he fears being forgotten. In a scholarly hall, measuring instruments and unlabeled sketches rest under soft light while scientists stand like guardians of knowledge. And Napoleon appears as patron, merging conquest with discovery. He understands modern power includes science, enlightened statecraft, or an impulse to annex even truth so nothing remains independent. At a border checkpoint enforcing economic warfare, inspectors open crates while merchants stand rigid with anxiety, and an officer holds a sealed order beside an unlabeled route chart. Napoleon's ambition tightens trade like a noose, strategic genius using policy as a weapon, or control addiction that strangles his own continent until resentment multiplies. In a rural home where contraband is hidden beneath floorboards, the air feels trapped as patrol figures stand at the threshold and a family freezes in fear when rules become too tight. Society grows underground, proof that systems collide with survival, and that absolute control invites the very defiance it fears. Late at night in a dim workroom, a globe and open map sit under lamplight while sealed dispatches pile up like demands that never sleep. And Napoleon leans over the table as if pressing down on the continent itself. Relentless focus can be genius, but also a compulsion, because resting would mean surrendering the sensation of command. In a hall of honors, recipients line up as unmarked medals rest on trays like currency, and Napoleon stands as the axis of gratitude and obligation. He binds talent to the state by reward, meritocracy as modern strength, or a ruler feeding on constant affirmation to keep doubt away. In a negotiated religious settlement, documents are sealed and placed with care while guards stand far enough to preserve the illusion of peace. And Napoleon reconciles faith by containing it. This can be wise stabilization, or it can be domination disguised as harmony. In another inspected classroom, the teacher's calm geometry and the inspector's sealed packet make learning feel like administration, not curiosity. The empire builds engineers and clerks who can read maps and follow procedures, national competence, or quiet conditioning into obedience. Back in the dynastic chamber, the arrangement of crowns around the map makes Europe look like a family estate. And Napoleon's gaze treats borders as inheritance. The question sharpens, is this the architect's mind seeking stability, or the addict's mind unable to accept any realm not personally tethered to him? In the conscription room again, The small travel packs at young men's feet become silent goodbyes. And the state's demand turns private lives into public resources. Genius may need sacrifice. But addiction to power always calls the sacrifice necessary. In the field, hospitals restrained stillness. Bandages and exhausted faces insist on a truth strategy tries to ignore. Every advance leaves a trail of bodies. Napoleon's ability to keep moving can look like strength, or like dependence on conquest to feel alive. In the atelier, the painted Napoleon outlives the living one. And the myth becomes a second empire built on imagery, if genius understands memory. Addiction needs memory, because without the world's gaze, power feels like it disappears. In a guarded intelligence room, an unlabeled wall map is threaded with pins and strings while agents stand over sealed dossiers like priests of secrecy. And even without Napoleon in the frame, his presence is felt in the discipline and urgency. Information becomes a weapon. And the question returns: brilliant prevention of chaos, or a power addiction that cannot breathe unless every whisper is monitored? Inside an artillery workshop, cannon barrels, wheel assemblies, and drafting tables covered with silent diagrams form a temple of precision. Where engineers freeze beside measuring tools and officers hold sealed orders, Napoleon inspects the machinery of force as if innovation is destiny, genius marrying science to war. Or compulsion sharpening the blade because stopping feels like weakness. On a river raft set for diplomacy, two rulers face each other over blank parchment and wax seals. While attendants stand rigid at the edges and the water reflects a muted sky, Napoleon seeks to turn victory into partnership, strategic brilliance. Or a craving for recognition from the only men left who can threaten his status. In a secluded palace chamber, the Pope sits under watch as officials hold sealed packets and a map without names. And the air feels like captivity disguised as negotiation. Napoleon reaches for spiritual legitimacy, statecraft balancing faith and empire. Or domination that cannot accept any independent source of influence. At the edge of a burned Spanish village, blackened beams and broken carts lie still under smoky haze while French soldiers stand in rigid lines and civilians hold distance with guarded posture. Occupation becomes a slow wound. And ambition meets resistance that refuses decisive battle, miscalculation by a genius. Or control addiction that insists obedience can be forced from a land that would rather bleed. In a grand European salon during the Congress of Vienna, diplomats gather around an unlabeled map of Europe divided into colored regions. And Napoleon's absence feels like a shadow that shapes every gesture. His ambition forced rivals to cooperate, creating containment as policy, proof of genius that changed diplomacy, or proof of a dangerous obsession that made Europe design cages for decades. In a quiet Viennese ballroom after negotiations, polished floors and chandelier light frame frozen clusters of statesmen, their sealed packets and blank reports suggesting borders being rebuilt in silence. Napoleon becomes the reference point for fear. And fear becomes architecture. Was he the builder of modern order? Or the disaster that taught nations to distrust greatness? In a small French kitchen, a sealed envelope lies on a wooden table beside blank ruled paper. And a young man stands with a travel pack while an older parent sits with hands clasped. The empire's demand enters the home like a cold draft, national mobilization as modern strength. Or power addiction that treats families as fuel for wars that never feel finished. In a British coastal tavern, sailors and merchants freeze around empty column papers and scattered coins while a naval officer holds a sealed packet. And ship masts loom outside in fog. Across the channel, Napoleon is still a topic, still a storm on the horizon, feared for his genius, or feared for his refusal to accept limits. On a windswept hillside on St. Helena, rough grass and grey ocean distance frame Napoleon by a simple fence line. A table holding an unlabeled map and a closed book, exile turns ambition into echo, asking whether genius can become insight, or whether the addiction to command makes every quiet day feel like humiliation. In a military academy lecture hall decades later, cadets sit frozen over notebooks open to blank lines, and an instructor points to a battlefield model with miniature hills and rivers. Napoleon's portrait hangs without a plaque. And his methods become doctrine, proof that genius advanced strategy, or proof that legend seduces institutions into worshipping willpower. In a civil courtroom, officials surround thick unmarked law books and blank forms sealed with wax while citizens wait in tense silence. Napoleon's reforms live on as procedure, stability through uniform law. or control embedded so deeply that the state's hand remains even after the man is gone. In a dim rural tavern, a veteran sits motionless by candlelight while younger listeners lean in, and a folded map without names lies on the table like a relic. Ambition is carried by those who fought for it. Did Napoleon give their sacrifice meaning? Or did his power hunger consume their youth and return them to ordinary life with extraordinary burdens? In a map-making workshop, cartographers stand over coastlines and borderlines without labels while an official holds a sealed packet. Unfinished maps hang like silent verdicts. War becomes geometry. Identity becomes ink, administrative genius, or domination that redraws lives as easily as lines. In a shuttered Italian meeting room, reformers stand frozen over an unlabeled regional map and blank pamphlet pages. With a Napoleon portrait watching like both inspiration and warning, his conquest spread ideas that later ignite nationalism, genius that accidentally accelerated modern politics, or obsession that provoked resistance strong enough to reshape Europe. In an austere Prussian office, officials stand by blank ledgers and an unlabeled map webbed with strings. Preparing reforms driven by fear of France, Napoleon's ambition forces rivals to modernize, proof of transformative genius, or proof of a destructive addiction that turns reform into permanent militarization. In a Russian village memorial scene, snow lies still around a simple marker with no inscription as villagers and a weary soldier hold their positions. For them, Napoleon is not a lawgiver but a storm that arrived and left silence. Can genius justify devastation? Or does the scale of suffering reveal ambition as something darker? In an archive room, historians freeze under lamplight with sealed letters and border maps. Weighing evidence like a trial without a verdict, Napoleon's life remains a courtroom argument, because genius and addiction can wear the same face. And history keeps returning to the same unresolved question. In a high telegraph relay station on a windy hill, the wooden signal frame stands like a mechanical nerve of the empire while operators freeze beside compasses and sealed packets. And distant towers dot the horizon. Napoleon's power learns to travel faster than horses, brilliant modernization. Or the impatience of a man who cannot tolerate delay because delay feels like losing control. At a rural postal relay house, fresh horses wait in rigid readiness beside a clock, wax seals, and blank ledgers, while a courier holds a sealed dispatch as if it is heavier than a weapon. The empire becomes a network of non-stop movement, efficient governance, or an addiction to command that demands the world respond instantly. Inside a provincial prefecture, shelves of unmarked binders and an unlabeled district map surround a desk stacked with sealed forms. While mayors stand tense as a gendarme guards the door, Napoleon extends himself through administration, state-building genius, or centralized control so tight that every village breathes through official permission. In a small town tax room, coin scales and sealed sacks sit in orderly piles as villagers line up with anxious faces. And the clerk's ledger opens to blank ruled lines. Ambition becomes extraction, financial stability for a modern state, or a constant draining of ordinary lives to feed campaigns that never truly end. Back in a Paris drafting room, jurists cluster around thick manuscripts with unmarked spines while Napoleon stands with his hand on a bound volume like a signature made flesh. Law becomes architecture, genius clarity after revolution, or control addiction turning life into rules so nothing ambiguous can escape the state. In a vast minting hall, heavy presses, metal blanks, and precise instruments align under pale window light as workers freeze beside trays of coin, and officials stand near a locked chest. Money becomes uniform trust, modern stability, or the desire to make every transaction flow through systems that ultimately point back to one center. At a coastal dockyard, half-built ships rise on scaffolding while ropes, timber, and cannon barrels sit ready, and officers study an unlabeled chart beside sealed orders. Napoleon reaches for the sea, strategic ambition, or refusal to accept any domain beyond his grasp. In a London print shop, paper stacks and blank poster layouts sit under lantern glow as artists and printers freeze. And a crowd gathers in curious tension. Across the channel, Napoleon becomes obsession and theater, proof that his ambition was not only military but psychological. Living in the public imagination. In a Paris salon of scholars and artifacts, glass cases hold instruments and outline sketches without captions, while Napoleon appears as patron. Linking conquest to knowledge and prestige, he builds an intellectual empire, enlightened investment, or the impulse to turn discovery into another trophy. In an aristocratic drawing room, polished floors and heavy curtains frame a tense gathering around a table holding a plain crown, a law volume, and an unlabeled map. Old elites debate in silence whether order is salvation or replacement tyranny. Because Napoleon's ambition reshapes hierarchy even when it claims to destroy it. In a colonial courtyard under palm shadows, officials stand rigid over sealed forms and an unlabeled coastal chart while soldiers guard a gate and local residents watch from a distance. Empire reaches beyond Europe, strategic competition. Or the same control addiction exported across oceans. In a Senate chamber, rows of officials hold blank-faced documents while Napoleon stands near ceremonial objects laid out like evidence. And guards seal the exits with posture alone. Legitimacy becomes theater, genius using institutions to stabilize rule. Or domination disguised as procedure. In a uniform workshop, blue coats, leather straps, and boot stacks line up like parts of a single machine as tailors freeze at tables and a quartermaster watches ledgers. Ambition becomes repetition, modern mass mobilization. Or endless preparation for war that turns labor into fuel. On a muddy refugee road, wagons and bundled families stand still beneath a pale sky while a wounded soldier sits near a broken wheel. Borders shift and civilians move because ambition moves. Raising the question whether modernization can ever justify displacement. In a museum storage room, curators freeze over a plain hat, telescope, compass, and an unmarked law volume. With an unlabeled Europe map under glass, power becomes residue, genius measured in institutions. Or addiction measured in the artifacts of endless conflict. In a formal treasury vault, iron doors and stacked chests surround Napoleon and officials as blank ledgers and sealed packets cover a table. Finance becomes the quiet engine, responsible order. Or an empire funded by extraction that must expand to pay for itself. At a coastal lighthouse, officers stand rigid with a telescope and an unlabeled chart as the grey sea stretches outward like a limit. Ambition meets the ocean again. The barrier Napoleon cannot command like roads, testing whether he can accept constraint. In a palace salon of diplomacy, gifts sit unmarked while ambassadors face Napoleon across an unlabeled map and sealed dossiers. And guards linger at doors, alliances become staged submission, brilliant orchestration. Or a craving for constant deference that makes peace feel temporary. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. In a pontoon engineering yard by a calm river, bridge sections, rope bundles, and barrel floats sit aligned like a promise. While engineers freeze with rulers and compasses and infantry stand guard, Napoleon studies an unlabeled river chart as if mobility itself is a weapon, ingenious mastery of geography. Or a compulsion to keep advancing because stopping feels like losing. In a Paris hospital administration office, bandage rolls and glass bottles share space with blank ledgers and sealed supply packets. And clerks hold still as if medicine has become paperwork. The state organizes care with the same precision as war. Asking whether this is modern compassion, or maintenance of bodies so the machine can continue. On a cold Polish riverbank at dawn, wagons wait on mud and frost while soldiers stand rigid beside stacked timber and an improvised crossing plan. Napoleon faces the water with a marshal holding a sealed dispatch. As if confidence alone can cancel distance, strategic resolve. Or the first step of overreach disguised as certainty. Inside a Paris bookstore, tall shelves and quiet customers create a scene of calm that is punctured by an inspector's sealed packet and watchful stance. Even ideas feel supervised. And the question sharpens, is this prudent order after revolution, or a ruler's need to control thought because uncontrolled thought threatens his grip? In a formal marriage negotiation chamber, an unmarked ring tray and blank contract pages sealed with wax sit between Napoleon and stiff-faced envoys. With an unlabeled Europe map nearby like a silent witness, romance is absent. Legitimacy is the goal, diplomatic genius, or an addiction to authority seeking hereditary validation to soothe insecurity. At a fortified coastal battery, cannon emplacements point toward a grey sea while soldiers stand frozen behind stone walls and an officer rests a telescope beside an unlabeled chart. The ocean remains a limit that cannot be marched across. Testing whether Napoleon can adapt, or whether his hunger for total reach turns limits into insults. In a grand hall of honors, Medals without inscriptions lie on trays like controlled currency while recipients form disciplined lines before Napoleon. He manufactures loyalty through reward, merit-based statecraft. Or the constant feeding of a leader who needs admiration is proof that power is real. In a quiet prison holding room, stone walls and a barred window frame a detainee seated in tense stillness while a guard grips keys and an official holds a sealed dossier. Stability is preserved by silence, raising the darker possibility that order here is less justice than fear dressed in procedure. On a snow-choked road during the Russian retreat, broken wagons and abandoned cannons sit half-buried while exhausted soldiers cluster in rigid despair. Napoleon stands slightly apart. Posture composed against catastrophe, unyielding genius. Or the final cost of a compulsion that delayed retreat until survival itself was uncertain. In a dim war council room in 1813, maps of multiple fronts lie open without names while sealed dispatch packets pile up like warnings. Napoleon stands at the table's head. Marshals frozen around him, and the empire feels like a structure held together by will alone, resilience of a master strategist. Or refusal to accept that the world no longer bends. At Fontainebleau, the abdication chamber is almost empty, plain chair, heavy curtains, blank parchments sealed in wax, and travel trunks wait by the door like a sentence. Napoleon stands isolated while officers hold their positions. And ambition finally meets a wall it cannot outmaneuver. In an archive like Tableau years later, shelves of unmarked boxes and sealed letters surround historians who study borders as thin lines on silent maps. Napoleon's story becomes evidence, not command, and the debate survives him because genius and addiction can produce the same relentless drive. Outside Leipzig, rain-dark fields and distant smoke haze frame rigid army blocks and clustered wagons. While Napoleon watches from an observation point over unlabeled maps, coalition pressure closes in from all directions. And brilliance fights arithmetic, because even genius can be overwhelmed when ambition refuses to shrink. In a Dutch port warehouse under strict enforcement, open crates and anxious merchants freeze as customs inspectors hold plane tags and an officer grips a sealed order. Economic warfare tightens like a vice, strategic innovation. Or control addiction that crushes commerce until hostility multiplies on both sides. Inside a civil registry office, citizens wait in a tense line while a clerk hovers over a ledger of blank ruled pages and an inspector stands near the door. Identity becomes standardized record, modern governance that stabilizes. Or a system that makes private life permanently measurable by the state. At a stone bridge construction site over a Paris river, scaffolding and cranes rise around a scale model with no labels while engineers freeze with measuring rods. Napoleon studies the design like a promise of permanence, visionary investment. Or a hunger to carve his authority into the city so time cannot erase it. At dusk on the edge of a Spanish village, a lantern-lit table holds an unlabeled terrain sketch while French patrols stand rigid and locals keep their distance with guarded posture. Here ambition meets insurgency that refuses to become a neat battlefield, exposing the limit of command over hearts. In a French coastal port under blockade pressure, half-empty docks and idle cranes sit beneath a grey horizon where ship silhouettes linger offshore. Merchants and officers freeze around an unlabeled chart and a telescope. And the empire feels trapped between continental control and maritime weakness. In the Banque de France boardroom, polished wood and tall windows frame bankers and officials frozen around coin weights, sealed sacks, and blank ruled ledgers. While Napoleon stands at the head like a silent guarantee, he turns finance into endurance, genius building modern stability. Or a power addiction that must control even money so no part of society escapes his hand. In a rural notary's office, a couple stands tense beside blank contract pages sealed with wax and a thick law volume with an unmarked spine. While the notary holds a quill like a judge of ordinary fate, Napoleon's code reaches into inheritance and marriage, clarity and fairness by design. Or control so deep it quietly rewrites private life as state procedure. In a desert-lit scholarly tent from the Egyptian expedition, instruments, crates, and outline sketches without captions lie under soft canvas shadows, while soldiers stand guard at the entrance and Napoleon appears as patron of knowledge. Conquest and science merge, enlightened ambition that expands learning. Or domination that turns discovery into another trophy for power. Inside a cathedral-like hall prepared for coronation, attendants hold plain cushions and unmarked regalia while clergy and guards stand in strict formation. And Napoleon waits with the calm of a man staging destiny. Legitimacy is engineered, genius stabilizing authority after revolution. Or an addiction to rule that needs sacred ritual because victory alone never feels sufficient. On a massive review field near Paris, long ranks of infantry, cavalry, and artillery form perfect symmetry beneath a pale sky. And Napoleon stands on a platform like the axis of the horizon. This scale can be national unity and defense. Or it can be the visible symptom of a ruler who needs the world to prove, again and again, that his will still fills the land. In a tense palace meeting in Central Europe, envoys and generals face each other across an unlabeled map and sealed packets. With guards near the doors and travel cases waiting in the shadows, diplomacy becomes pressure, strategic genius converting war into borders. Or a power hunger that treats every treaty as a pause before the next advance. In a Paris newsroom under oversight, desks and ink pots sit beneath dim lamps as editors freeze over blank column layouts while a censor holds sealed directives. The conquest shifts from territory to narrative, prudent control during war. Or an addiction to dominance that fears independent thought more than enemy armies. Back at Longwood on St. Helena, a plain desk holds blank pages, sealed letters, and a folded map without names as Napoleon sits in still contemplation under watch, when command is gone. Story becomes the last battlefield, genius seeking honest reflection, or control addiction trying to rule memory because it cannot rule anything else. At misty dawn outside Moscow, charred streets and smoky haze stretch behind a field table with an unlabeled city plan. And Napoleon stands rigid at the edge of ruin. He has captured a capital that will not submit, proof of daring strategy. Or the moment ambition reveals itself as compulsion, chasing symbols even when control is impossible. On a frozen river crossing during retreat, cracked ice and half-submerged carts frame soldiers and engineers frozen in tense calculation. While a marshal holds a sealed dispatch and Napoleon watches from a small rise, the empire becomes survival math, genius tested by catastrophe. Or an addiction that delayed withdrawal until the cost became nearly total. Inside a musket workshop, metal parts and finished weapons align in relentless order as workers freeze with hammers and calipers. And an officer grips sealed orders demanding more. Industry becomes the hidden engine of conquest, modernization through production. Or the machinery of a ruler who cannot stop feeding war because peace would feel like emptiness. In a quiet Paris courtroom, lawyers hold folders open to blank ruled pages while a gendarme stands near the door and an official guards a sealed dossier. Justice looks orderly, yet heavy, genius building uniform law. Or power addiction using procedure to make dissent disappear without noise. In the Tuileries map room, a huge unlabeled Europe map dominates the wall as Napoleon stands on a small platform and aides hold compasses and rolled charts. He sees the continent as a surface to shape, strategic brilliance that reads patterns. Or obsession that reduces nations into pieces that must move until his center feels absolute. In a treaty antechamber, blank parchments sealed with wax lie beside an unlabeled map and ruler. While diplomats and generals hold their stiff postures under chandelier light, peace is drafted like a maneuver, genius accepting limits. Or a ruler who treats peace as another tactic, never an end. On a Paris street at night under curfew, wet cobblestones reflect lamplight while gendarmes freeze at an intersection and a civilian clutches a sealed letter in a doorway. Order is enforced by presence, necessary stability in crisis. Or the silent spread of fear that reveals control as the true addiction. During a school inspection, students sit rigid with notebooks open to blank lines while an inspector holds a sealed packet and a globe rests nearby without labels. The empire shapes minds to match the machine, national competence and literacy. Or training in obedience that makes the state feel permanent inside the child. At a market under price controls, merchants and customers stand frozen in tense lines while an official watches coin scales and blank ledgers. And a chart of empty columns hangs like a warning. Governance fights scarcity, clever management for stability. Or the insistence that everything must be controlled even when hunger and reality refuse. In a coastal fortification planning room, engineers freeze over wooden bastion models and an unlabeled shoreline map while a telescope rests by sealed dispatch packets. Even defense becomes obsession, strategic adaptation to blockade. Or the refusal to admit limits because admitting limits feels like losing power. On a windy hill outside Paris, a semaphore telegraph station stands like a wooden skeleton against the sky. its rigid arms locked in position while operators hold compasses and sealed packets. Napoleon's empire learns to move orders at the speed of sight, genius modern communication. Or the impatience of a ruler who cannot tolerate waiting because waiting feels like losing control. At a rural postal relay, fresh horses stand ready beside a clock, wax seals, and blank ruled ledgers as a courier grips a sealed dispatch like a lifeline. The empire becomes a chain of non-stop movement, efficient governance. Or a compulsion that demands the world respond instantly to one man's will. Inside a provincial prefecture, shelves of unmarked binders and an unlabeled district map frame a desk piled with sealed forms. While local mayors stand tense and a gendarme guards the door, centralized administration spreads like roots, state-building genius. Or control addiction that makes every village breathe through permission. In a small town tax office, coin scales and sealed sacks sit in neat piles while villagers wait in a silent line. And the clerk's ledger opens to blank ruled lines like a quiet sentence. Ambition becomes extraction, modern finance that stabilizes. Or relentless pressure that drains ordinary lives to feed campaigns that never truly finish. Back in a Paris codification room, jurists cluster around thick manuscripts with unmarked spines while Napoleon rests a hand on a bound volume as if law is another battlefield conquered. Clarity after revolution can be genius, or it can be domination. Reducing life to rules so nothing ambiguous can escape the state. In a vast minting hall, heavy presses, metal blanks, and measuring instruments align under pale window light while workers freeze beside trays of coin. And officials hover near a locked chest. Uniform currency builds trust, modern stability. Or the desire to control every exchange so power flows back to one center. At a coastal dockyard, half-built ships rise on scaffolding while ropes, timber, and cannon barrels wait in disciplined stacks. And officers study an unlabeled chart beside sealed orders. The ocean remains the last barrier, strategic ambition. Or refusal to accept any domain outside his grasp. In a lighthouse station facing grey Atlantic water, a lookout stands rigid by a telescope while officers hold sealed packets and an unlabeled shoreline chart. Even the horizon feels like a threat. Testing whether Napoleon can accept limits, or whether his hunger turns limits into insults. In a Dutch warehouse under continental system enforcement, inspectors open crates while merchants freeze with anxious posture, and a French officer grips a sealed order like a blade. Policy becomes siege, strategic genius using economics as war. Or control addiction that tightens until commerce breaks and resentment multiplies. In a farmhouse where contraband hides beneath floorboards, a family holds still as patrol figures fill the doorway with silent authority. The tighter the grip, the more society slips underground, proof that absolute control invites defiance. And that an empire can be undermined by survival itself. In a dim tavern, a veteran sits by candlelight with medals rendered as plain discs. While younger listeners lean in and an unlabeled map lies on the table like a ghost. Napoleon's ambition lives in the bodies that carried it. Did genius give their suffering meaning? Or did power hunger consume their youth and leave only stories? In a map-making workshop, cartographers freeze over coastlines and borderlines without labels while an official holds a sealed packet. Unfinished maps hang like silent verdicts. War becomes geometry, administrative genius shaping modern states. Or domination that redraws lives as casually as ink. In a shuttered Italian room, reformers stand over an unlabeled regional map and blank pamphlet pages. With a Napoleon portrait watching like both inspiration and warning, his conquest spread ideas that ignite nationalism, unintended genius accelerating modern politics. Or obsession provoking resistance strong enough to reshape Europe. Inside an austere Prussian office, officials stand by blank ledgers and an unlabeled map webbed with strings. Preparing reforms driven by fear of France, Napoleon forces rivals to modernize, transformative genius. Or destructive addiction that turns reform into permanent militarization. In a Russian village memorial scene, snow lies still around a simple marker with no inscription as villagers hold candles and a weary soldier stands at the edge. For them, Napoleon is not a lawgiver but a storm. Can any genius justify devastation? Or does the suffering reveal ambition's darker core? In a quiet archive, historians freeze under lamplight with sealed letters and border maps. Weighing evidence like a trial without a verdict, Napoleon becomes a case file for centuries. Because genius and addiction can wear the same face and produce the same relentless momentum. In a museum display hall, glass cases hold a plain hat, telescope, and sword on velvet with no readable labels while visitors stand motionless searching for meaning. Power becomes artifact, proof of modern institutions built, and proof of wars endured, leaving the question intact: builder or compulsive conqueror? In an artist's studio, a dramatic canvas fixes Napoleon into heroic stillness while assistants hold drapery and the painter raises a brush like a ritual. Myth is manufactured, brilliant understanding of memory, or the need to be worshipped because without the world's gaze, power feels like it disappears. In an imperial treasury vault, iron doors and stacked chests surround officials frozen over blank ruled ledgers and sealed packets. While Napoleon stands like the silent guarantor of solvency, finance becomes the quiet engine of empire, genius creating stability, or an addiction to expansion that needs constant resources just to keep the illusion of permanence alive. In a coastal fortification plan room, engineers hold compasses over an unlabeled shoreline map and wooden bastion models, while a telescope rests beside sealed dispatches. Defense is drafted like a campaign, strategic adaptation, or the refusal to admit limits because admitting limits feels like losing power. In a naval dockyard, half-built ships rise on scaffolding as ropes, tar barrels, and timber stacks sit in disciplined rows, and offices freeze around an unlabeled coastal chart. Napoleon's ambition reaches for the sea again, bold vision, or obsession chasing a domain that will not submit. In a Paris theater under quiet supervision, a manager stands rigid above blank scripts while a censor holds a sealed directive near the stage, and guards linger at the side door. Culture becomes territory, genius preventing unrest, or power addiction that cannot tolerate uncontrolled stories. In a bookstore where customers freeze beside unmarked volumes, an inspector's sealed packet and watchful stance turn reading into risk. Ideas are monitored not because they are weak, but because they are powerful, prudent order after revolution, or fear-driven control that reveals insecurity at the heart of command. In a narrow Paris apartment, a citizen holds an empty column newspaper layout while listening for footsteps, and a sealed letter rests on the desk like contraband. The empire's presence enters private life, stability through vigilance, or a society trained to whisper because authority is always nearby. At a market under regulation, merchants and buyers stand motionless in tense lines as an official watches coin scales and blank ledgers, and an empty chart hangs like a warning. Governance fights scarcity, smart management, or the insistence to control everything even when hunger and reality refuse. In a provincial classroom, students sit rigid with notebooks open to blank lines while an inspector observes and a globe sits nearby without labels. The state shapes minds, national competence, or obedience training that makes centralized power feel natural. In a prefecture office, local mayors face a desk piled with sealed forms beneath an unlabeled district map, and a gendarme guards the door. Administration spreads into every village, modern statecraft, or control addiction that tightens until local life becomes an extension of the capital. In a tax collection room, villagers wait silently while sealed sacks and coin weights sit like quiet accusations, and the clerk's blank ledger lines promise no mercy. Ambition becomes extraction, necessary revenue for a modern state, or relentless pressure to fund wars that never satisfy the ruler's appetite. In a bridge construction site over a Paris river, cranes and scaffolding frame a scale model while engineers freeze with measuring rods, and Napoleon studies stone as if it can defeat time. Infrastructure is legacy, visionary investment, or the need to carve authority into the city so history cannot forget. In a Paris codification chamber, jurists cluster around thick law volumes with unmarked spines while Napoleon rests his hand on the binding like a signature. Uniform law can be genius, yet it can also be domination, turning life into rules so nothing ambiguous can escape state control. In a palace antechamber before treaty signing, blank parchments sealed with wax lie beside an unlabeled map as diplomats hold stiff postures under chandelier light. Peace is drafted like a maneuver, genius accepting limits, or a ruler who treats peace as a pause before the next push. In a Spanish village at dusk, a lantern-lit table holds an unlabeled terrain sketch while French patrols stand rigid and locals keep their distance with guarded bodies. Ambition meets insurgency that refuses to be organized into a decisive battle, exposing how control breaks when hearts do not submit. On a cold riverbank before the Russian campaign, Wagons and timber wait under a pale sky while Napoleon faces the crossing with sealed dispatches in hand. Confidence looks like mastery, yet it may be the first symptom of overreach. When ambition hears warnings and calls them challenges. In the burned streets outside Moscow, smoke haze and charred beams surround a field table with an unlabeled city plan. And Napoleon stands rigid before emptiness. He has captured a symbol without gaining control, strategic daring. Or compulsion, chasing trophies even when they cannot deliver obedience. On a frozen retreat road, abandoned cannon and broken carts sit half-buried while soldiers cluster in still despair and Napoleon stands slightly apart. Composed against collapse, resilience can be genius, yet it can also be the price of addiction. When retreat comes too late because they will refuse to accept it. In a dim war council room, unlabeled maps of multiple fronts lie open as sealed dispatch packets pile up like warnings. And marshals freeze around Napoleon. The empire is held together by will and habit, brilliant stubbornness in crisis. Or refusal to accept that the world no longer bends to one man. In a rain-dark field outside Leipzig, churned mud and distant smoke hang over rigid troop blocks and clustered wagons. While Napoleon stands at a raised observation point above unlabeled maps, coalition war squeezes him from every direction. And genius collides with arithmetic when ambition refuses to shrink. In a crowded supply depot after the battle, stacks of boots, coats, and crates sit in strict rows beside blank ruled ledgers. While quartermasters freeze with sealed packets that feel like apologies, the empire is suddenly measured in shortages. Exposing how limitless ambition can outpace even the best logistics. In a central European palace corridor, envoys hold still around an unlabeled Europe map and wax-sealed parchments. Their posture stiff with mistrust, Napoleon bargains for time and breathing room, either strategic realism or the addict's instinct to negotiate only long enough to pursue the next surge. On the road back toward France, refugees, broken wagons, and abandoned gear form a silent procession beneath a pale sky. While civilians stand frozen with bundles in their arms, the cost of ambition appears not as glory but displacement. Reminding us that borders move, and people are forced to follow. In Paris, a tense Senate chamber holds officials frozen with blank-faced documents as guards stand near the doors. Legitimacy is summoned like a ritual to hold the state together. Yet the very stillness suggests how fragile power becomes when the aura of inevitability begins to fade. In Fontainebleau again, the abdication room feels stripped to essentials: plain chair, heavy curtains, blank parchments sealed in wax, travel trunks by the door. While Napoleon stands isolated and marshals keep the distance, the conqueror meets a limit that cannot be outmaneuvered, only endured. On Elba, a small port and steep hillside form a reduced world. With a modest residence and a distant guard presence implied by watchful silhouettes, Napoleon appears smaller against the landscape. And ambition turns restless. Can genius accept a narrow stage? Or does obsession demand a larger one at any cost? In an island planning room, an unlabeled map of the Mediterranean lies on a table beside sealed packets and a simple compass. While a few loyal officers stand frozen, even exile becomes a workshop of possibility. Because an addicted will does not stop wanting, it only waits for an opening. On a French beach, returning soldiers stand rigid in stunned silence as Napoleon steps onto familiar soil under a grey sky. And sealed papers change hands as if history is restarting. The moment feels like a relapse, dramatic brilliance of timing. Or the irresistible pull of power that he cannot refuse. Along a country road lined with bare trees, troops freeze in formation while officers hold sealed orders and civilians watch from doorways. Loyalty returns like a tide, suggesting that charisma can resurrect an empire in days, yet it also suggests how quickly a nation can be drawn back into the orbit of one man's hunger. In Paris, a hurried council room fills with unlabeled maps and blank-faced reports as ministers stand rigid around Napoleon. The air is electric with urgency. As if the state is being rebuilt on instinct and speed, genius improvisation, or compulsion that cannot tolerate staying defeated. In a Belgian countryside field before Waterloo, artillery pieces align in disciplined rows and infantry blocks hold still under a low sky. While Napoleon stands near a table of unlabeled terrain sketches, he prepares for one decisive throw. The kind a genius trusts, and the kind an addict needs. After the battle, the landscape becomes an inventory of loss: muddy ground, abandoned wagons, scattered equipment, and the haze of smoke that refuses to clear, offices freeze around sealed packets that now feel meaningless. Because defeat turns every plan into paper. Back in Paris, the streets are tense again, patrol silhouettes, shuttered windows, anxious faces, while trunks reappear by doors as if the city remembers the last collapse. Ambition has looped the nation through the same fear, raising the question whether return was courage or compulsion. At Rochefort once more, the harbor wind rattles rigging over packed luggage and sealed documents, and Napoleon faces the sea with the same boundary before him. Repetition becomes verdict, suggesting that addiction often returns to the same doorway, hoping for a different ending. On a British ship's deck again, sailors move with quiet routine while Napoleon stands near the rail under a flat horizon. The second exile feels less like tragedy and more like consequence, because the world has learned that containment is the only safety it trusts. On St. Helena's rough hillside, the ocean sits far below as an unmoving grey band, and a simple table holds an unlabeled map and a closed book. Ambition now has nowhere to march, so it must wrestle with memory, or with the unbearable silence of powerlessness. In a lamplit archive years later, historians freeze over sealed letters, border maps, and an unmarked law volume. With a plain hat and telescope arranged like evidence, the final battlefield is interpretation. Because Napoleon's limitless ambition still refuses to choose one identity, genius or addict, forcing history to hold both truths at once. In the plain room at Longwood, a single lamp throws soft light over blank pages, sealed letters, and a folded map without names. And Napoleon sits rigidly at the desk as if writing is the last form of command, because if he cannot rule events, he will try to rule the meaning of events. Near the doorway, a guard's quiet presence turns every sheet of paper into something monitored. And even private words feel like territory under occupation. The empire is gone. Yet the instinct to control, and to be controlled, still frames his days like a silent border. Across a small table, a companion holds an unmarked book while Napoleon's posture suggests he is still arranging campaigns in his mind. Turning memory into strategy, genius can become reflection, but addiction becomes rehearsal, repeating power in the imagination because the body cannot act. An unlabeled map of Europe lies open, and he studies it like a ghost studies its former home, rivers without names, borders without labels, yet everything recognizable. The continent that once moved at his pace now moves without him. And that separation becomes its own punishment. In a cramped medical space, bottles and instruments sit in disciplined order while a doctor stands at a careful distance. And Napoleon's stillness feels heavier than any uniform. The body sets limits no marshal can negotiate. And ambition meets the simplest authority of all, decline. Outside, wind and fog press against the windows, and the island's isolation becomes palpable. No cities, no crowds, no drums, only distance. For a man who lived on acceleration, the slow rhythm of exile is not rest, it is deprivation. In the garden path's thin grass, Napoleon stands with a cane, framed by a fence line that defines his world, while a watcher remains far enough away to preserve dignity but close enough to deny freedom. The scene asks whether patience is possible for someone whose identity was movement. Back inside, the desk waits again, blank pages, sealed packets, and the stubborn need to explain, if his ambition was genius. These words might become warning and insight, but if it was addiction, these words might become the final attempt to keep control by controlling the story. In the bedchamber, curtains soften the light and companions hold their positions in silent restraint. Because the end is intimate even for emperors, the man who made nations march now must face stillness that cannot be commanded. At a simple gravesite on St. Helena, wind moves through grass as a small group stands motionless, and the burial feels both final and strangely incomplete. The body is gone. Yet the legend begins to grow, fed by distance and unanswered questions. On the continent, diplomats gather around Europe's future with maps and sealed agreements. And Napoleon's absence shapes every calculation like an invisible hand. Containment becomes policy. As if nations learned that one man's ambition can force everyone else to build cages. In a quiet French room years later, loyalists and skeptics hold still around whispered plans and sealed letters. Because the idea of Napoleon outlives Napoleon, genius becomes hope to some, and addiction becomes warning to others, and both interpretations mobilize emotion. When Paris changes regimes, his memory changes costumes, sometimes celebrated, sometimes feared, yet always useful. The state learns that even a dead emperor can be a tool, if you can frame his ambition as either salvation or catastrophe. In 1840, a grand ceremonial hall glows with restrained light as officials and veterans stand in disciplined lines and a coffin is honored with ritual precision. France brings him home in ceremony, transforming the man into national property, no longer a ruler, but a symbol to be curated. In military schools, cadets sit rigid with notebooks open to blank lines while an instructor points to battlefield models and silent maps. And Napoleon becomes doctrine. If he was genius, they are studying mastery, but if he was addicted to power, they are studying how obsession can masquerade as destiny. In courtrooms, thick law volumes with unmarked spines sit on desks as clerks fill blank forms and citizens wait in tense lines. His reforms persist as procedure, proving that whatever his motives, his ambition left institutions that still shape ordinary lives. Across Paris, bridges, roads, and stone monuments stand in quiet permanence, reminding everyone that conquest is not the only form of legacy. The question becomes sharper because building can coexist with reshaped, creation and destruction born from the same relentless drive. In a museum-like room, a plain hat, a telescope, a compass, and a bound law book sit under glass without labels while visitors stand motionless searching for meaning. Artifacts cannot answer motives. They only confirm impact, leaving the final verdict to the living. In a lamplit archive hall, shelves of unmarked boxes tower like silent judges while historians stand frozen over border maps and sealed letters, weighing evidence as if Napoleon's life were a case that never closes. The records cannot agree on motive, only on magnitude. On a curator's table, a plain hat, a telescope, a compass, and an unmarked law volume lie arranged like courtroom exhibits. Because Napoleon's empire is now studied through objects, tools of war, tools of governance, tools of legend, each pointing to a different face of the same ambition. A researcher leans over an unlabeled map of Europe under glass, tracing thin border lines that look simple but cost thousands of lives. And the map's silence exposes the brutality of turning human complexity into geometry. Another historian holds a wax-sealed packet with no visible writing, as if holding the weight of decisions made behind closed doors, conscription lists, censorship orders, treaty instructions, proof that modern power often operates through paperwork as much as through battle. In a museum gallery, visitors stand motionless before a portrait of Napoleon without a plaque, because everyone already knows him. Yet no one can fully agree on what he was. Familiarity becomes another kind of mystery. Some linger at displays of infrastructure, bridge models, road plans, mint tools, seeing in him a builder who stabilized a nation after revolution, a strategist who understood that order must be engineered, not wished into existence. Others pause at depictions of retreat roads, burned towns, and crowded hospitals, seeing instead a man who could not stop, who treated peace as a pause and conquest as a need, leaving behind scars that never fit neatly inside the word genius. In a quiet reading room, a blank-faced newspaper layout and sealed censorship directive sit beside each other, reminding the viewer that controlling armies was only half the project, controlling the story was the other half. And both fed the same appetite for dominance. Across the hall, civil registry ledgers and standardized legal forms, pages of ruled lines without names, suggest that Napoleon's ambition became a structure that outlived him, embedding the state into marriage, property, and identity, for better and for worse. A military academy display shows battlefield models and motionless formations, honoring the tactical mind that changed warfare. Yet even here, the exhibit hints that brilliance can become a trap when it convinces a leader that every problem has a decisive solution. In a corner case, a simple ring box and dynastic artifact sit without insignia, echoing how personal life was sacrificed to legitimacy, how intimacy was traded for lineage, and how a hunger for permanence can consume what is human. Another case holds a small set of coin weights and minting tools, suggesting that stability was not accidental, that he built systems capable of lasting, yet systems can also be cages, especially when designed to concentrate authority. The archive's stillness becomes a mirror. Napoleon's ambition appears both as an engine of modernization and as a mechanism of coercion, both as discipline and as compulsion, both as order and as pressure. If he was a genius, then his tragedy is that genius can mistake momentum for destiny, believing that willpower alone can defeat distance, winter, oceans, and human resentment. If he was addicted to power, then his tragedy is that addiction can wear the mask of brilliance. Because obsession creates focus, and focus can win, until the costs outgrow the victories. The historians do not close the file. Because the question refuses closure: how much suffering is acceptable for order? And how much order is merely fear arranged into institutions? In the end, Napoleon remains the defining test of kings and conquerors, proof that one person's limitless ambition can build roads and laws, and can also fill roads with refugees and laws with silence. And the final frame holds steady on the same unresolved verdict: Napoleon Bonaparte was both a strategic mind of rare power, and a man whose craving for control could not stop, leaving history to live forever in the tension between genius and addiction. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think.